The Beatles leave London Airport in 1964. From left, John Lennon, Ringo Starr, Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Enthusiastic fans welcomed the Beatles in airports and concert halls around the world in 1964, as Beatlemania swept the globe. In 1964, the Beatles achieved an unprecedented level of success both in their home country of Britain and in the United States. Sightseeing in Paris, on January 15, 1964, the day before their opening at the Olympia Theatre in Paris, 3 of Britain's 4 Beatles pause for a look around on the Champs-Élysées. From left, John Lennon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison. In the background is the Arc de Triomphe. They amassed crowds of adoring fans that followed them wherever they went, a phenomenon often referred to as Beatlemania. John Lennon, left. George Harrison, center holding guitar. And Ringo Starr from the Beatles, backstage in Versailles, France, on January 15, 1964. On February 9, 1964, an estimated 73 million people tuned in to see the Beatles perform live on The Ed Sullivan Show, a popular television program. The Beatles performed their first concert outside of Britain, at the Olympia in Paris, on January 17, 1964. This meant that 45% of homes with televisions in the U.S. Police hold back screaming fans fighting to get near their idols, the Beatles, when the Liverpool pop group returned to London Airport from Paris on February 5, 1964. A strong police escort had to accompany the 4 Beatles from their aircraft to the Customs Channel. 3 Beatles fans attempt to enter the customs hall at London Airport by crawling into the baggage conveyor belt on February 5, 1964. Were watching the Beatles, a record at that time. The Beatles, from left, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, in their New York hotel after their arrival in the US on February 7, 1964. The British rock group, on their first American tour, was pelted with jelly beans and candy kisses by screaming teenage fans. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, coupled with radio play and album promotion, spurred their meteoric rise in America. The Beatles faced the media on their arrival in New York on February 7, 1964. By April 4, 1964, the group held the first 5 spots on the Billboard Hot 100 list of popular songs, with Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand and Please Please Me crowding the top of the charts. Beatles fans push forward in hopes of getting a view of the band after their arrival for an American tour in New York on February 7, 1964. No other act in history has achieved such a feat. The Beatles on the set of The Ed Sullivan Show in New York on February 8, 1964. In 1965, their concert at New York's Shea Stadium marked the first time that a large outdoor stadium had been used for such a purpose. The British rock and roll group The Beatles are surrounded by photographers on stage at CBS' Studio 50 before their live television appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in New York City on February 9, 1964. The event attracted an audience of 55,000, the largest of any live concert that the Beatles performed. Paul McCartney, 21 years old, on the set of The Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles on February 9, 1964. Beatles fans were so excited and determined to see the band that police sometimes resorted to using fire hoses to hold them back. Paul McCartney, right, shows his guitar to Ed Sullivan before the Beatles' live television appearance in New York on February 9, 1964. Behind Sullivan, from left, Beatles manager Brian Epstein, John Lennon, and Ringo Starr. The Beatles provided one of the first opportunities for female teenagers in Britain to exhibit spending power and publicly express sexual desire, while the group's image suggested a disregard for adults' opinions and parents' ideas of morality. The Beatles perform on The Ed Sullivan Show in New York on February 9, 1964. An estimated 73 million viewers, more than a third of the US, saw the performance, a record audience at the time. In the description of author and musician Bob Stanley, the band's domestic breakthrough represented a final liberation for the nation's teenagers, and, by coinciding with the end of national service, the group effectively signaled the end of World War II in Britain. The Beatles perform at the Coliseum in Washington, District of Columbia, during their first American tour. By 1966, John Lennon controversially remarked that the group were more popular than Jesus now. The British rock and roll group The Beatles perform at Carnegie Hall in New York City on February 12, 1964. Soon after, the Beatles' travels were further entangled by mob revolt, violence, political backlash and threats of assassination, as well as more extreme displays of deity-like worship. Beatle Paul McCartney flashes a smile as he rushes from New York's Carnegie Hall after two wild performances on February 12, 1964. Behind him is bandmate John Lennon. They were so overwhelmed that they stopped touring and became a studio-only band. The Beatles rehearse for their second appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, 1964. Although commentators speculated that the move would lead to a decline in popularity, their 1967 album Sgt. The Beatles take a fake blow from Cassius Clay, who later changed his name to Muhammad Ali, while visiting the heavyweight contender at his training camp in Miami Beach, Florida, on February 18, 1964. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was critically acclaimed and revolutionized the music industry. The Beatles wait in the surf in Miami, Florida in February of 1964, with unidentified women. By then, the Beatlemania phenomenon had largely subsided, though the group maintained a loyal following and commanded much cultural influence throughout the remainder of their career and in the decades since. Two of the Beatles, George Harrison, left, and Ringo Starr, right, at the beach in Miami, Florida, in February of 1964. Others are unidentified. Sightseeing in Paris, on January 15, 1964, the day before their opening at the Olympia Theatre in Paris, three of Britain's four Beatles pause for a look around on the Champs-Élysées. Policemen good-humoredly control screaming Beatles fans as the Liverpool pop group were welcomed by a group of more than 5,000 on their arrival at London Airport on February 22, 1964, on their return from America. From left John Lennon, Paul McCartney and George Harrison. The Beatles arrive at London Airport, England, February 22, 1964, after their visit to the United States. In the foreground is Paul McCartney, carrying record albums under his arm, including The Best of Major Lance, and George Harrison, left, talking to John Lennon. In the background is the Arc de Triomphe. The Beatles, to left of flagpole, are surrounded by newsmen and press photographers and overlooked by hundreds of fans after their arrival at London Airport, England, having flown in from New York on February 22, 1964. Photo credit, AP Photo. The Beatles rehearse for their forthcoming television show at Wembley Studios in London in April of 1964. In this skit, Ringo Starr, second from left, is costumed as Sir Francis Drake, and the others, from left, John Lennon, George Harrison and Paul McCartney play heralds.